Identify assumptions and constraints. Task 1-3. Identify the specific assumptions and constraints under which the risk assessment is conducted. Supplemental guidance. As part of the risk framing step in the risk management process, organizations make explicit the specific assumptions, constraints, risk tolerance, and priorities or trade-offs used within organizations to make investment and operational decisions. This information guides the informs organizational risk assessments. An organizational risk management strategy cannot be cited. Risk assessment identify and document assumptions and constraints. Assumptions and constraints identified by organizations during the risk framing step and included as part of the organizational risk management strategy need not be repeated in each individual risk assessment. By making assumptions and constraints explicit, there is greater clarity in the risk model selected for the risk assessment, increased reproducibility or repeatability of assessment results, and an increased opportunity for reciprocity among organizations. Organizations identify assumptions in key areas relevant to the risk assessment, including, for example, first, threat sources, second, threat events, third, vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions, fourth, potential impacts, fifth, assessment and analysis approaches, and sixth, which missions or business functions are primary. Organizations also identify constraints in key areas relevant to the risk assessment, including, for example, first, resources available for the assessment, second, skills and expertise required for the assessment, and third, operational considerations related to mission and business activities. For example, organizational assumptions about how threats and impacts should be assessed can range from using worst-case projections to using best-case projections, or anything in between those endpoints. Finally, organizations consider the uncertainty with regard to assumptions made or other information used in the risk assessment. Uncertainty in assumption can affect organizational risk tolerance. For example, assumptions based on a lack of specific or credible information may reduce an organization's risk tolerance because of the uncertainty influencing the assumptions. The following sections provide some representative examples of areas where assumptions or constraints for risk assessments may be identified. Threat sources. Organizations determine which types of threat sources are to be considered during risk assessments. Organizations make explicit the process used to identify threats and any assumptions related to the threat and identification process. If such information is identified during the risk framing step and included as part of the organizational risk management strategy, the information needs to be repeated in each individual risk assessment. Risk assessments can address all types of threat sources, a single broad threat source, for example adversarial, or a specific threat source, for example trusted insider. Table D2 provides a sample taxonomy of threat sources that can be considered by organizations in identifying assumptions for risk assessments. Organizational assumptions about threat sources to consider inform Task 2-1. Threat events. Organizations determine which type of threat events are to be considered during risk assessments and the level of detail needed to describe such events. Descriptions of threat events can be expressed in highly general terms, for example phishing, distributed denial of service, in more descriptive terms using tactics, techniques, and procedures, or in highly specific terms, for example the names of specific information systems, technologies, organizations, roles, or locations. In addition, organizations consider, first, what representative set of threat events can serve as a starting point for the identification of specific threat events in a risk assessment, and second, what degree of confirmation is needed for threat events to be considered relevant for purposes of the risk assessment. For example, organizations may consider only those threat events that have been observed either internally or by organizations that are peers or partners, or all possible threat events. Table E2 and Table E3 provide representative examples of adversarial and non-adversarial threat events at a level of detail that can be used for risk assessments at all tiers. Greater detail can be found in multiple sources, for example, Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification, CAPEC. Organizational assumptions about threat events to consider and level of detail in Form Task 2-2. Vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. Organizations determine the types of vulnerabilities that are to be considered during risk assessments and the level of detail provided in the vulnerability descriptions. Organizations make explicit the process used to identify vulnerabilities and any assumptions related to the vulnerability identification process. If such information is identified during the risk framing step and included as part of the organizational risk management strategy, the information needs to be repeated in each individual risk assessment. Vulnerabilities can be associated with organizational information systems, for example, hardware, software, firmware, internal controls, and security procedures, or environments in which those systems operate, for example, organizational governance, external relationships, mission, business processes, enterprise architectures, information security architectures. Organizations also determine the types of predisposing conditions that are to be considered during risk assessments, including, for example, architectures and technologies employed, environments of operation, and personnel. Table F4 provides representative examples of such predisposing conditions. Organizational assumptions about vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions to consider and level of detail in Form Task 2-3. Likelihood. Organizations may explicit the process used to conduct likelihood determinations and any assumptions related to the likelihood determination process. If such information is identified during the risk framing step and included as part of the organizational risk management strategy, the information needs to be repeated in each individual risk assessment. Organizational assumptions about how the determined likelihood inform Task 2-4. Impacts. Organizations determine potential adverse impacts in terms of organizational operations, for example, missions, functions, image, and reputation, organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Organizations make explicit the process used to conduct impact determinations and any assumptions related to the impact determination process. If such information is identified during the risk framing step and included as part of the organizational risk management strategy, the information needs to be repeated in each individual risk assessment. Organizations address impacts at a level of detail that includes, for example, specific mission and business processes or information resources, for example, information, personnel, equipment, funds, and information technology. Organizations may include information from business impact analysis with regards to providing impact information for risk assessments. Table H2 provides representative examples of types of impacts, for example, harm, that can be considered by organizations. Organizational assumptions about how to determine impacts and at what level of detail inform Task 2-5. Risk tolerance and uncertainty. Organizations determine the level and types of risk that are acceptable. Risk tolerance is determined as part of the organizational risk management strategy to ensure consistency across the organization. Organizations also provide guidance on how to identify reasons for its uncertainty when risk factors are assessed. Since uncertainty in one or more factors will propagate to the resulting evaluation of level of risk and how to compensate for incomplete, imperfect, or assumption-dependent estimates. Consideration of uncertainty is especially important when organizations consider advanced persistent threats, APT, since assessments of the likelihood of threat event occurrence can have a great degree of uncertainty. To compensate, organizations can take a variety of approaches to determine likelihood, ranging from assuming the worst-case likelihood, certain to happen sometime in a foreseeable future, to assuming that if an event has not been observed, it is unlikely to happen. Organizations also determine what levels of risk, combination of likelihood and impact, indicate that no further analysis of any risk factors is needed. Analytical approach. Risk assessments include both assessment approaches, for example, quantitative, qualitative, semi-quantitative, and analysis approaches, for example, threat-oriented, asset or impact-oriented, vulnerability-oriented. Together, the assessment and analysis approaches form the analytic approach for the risk assessment. Organizations determine the level of detail and in what form threats are analyzed, including the level of granularity to describe threat events of threat or threat scenarios. Different analysis approaches can lead to different levels of detail in characterizing adverse events for which likelihoods are determined. For example, an adverse event could be characterized in several ways, with increasing levels of detail. First, a threat event, for which the likelihood is determined by taking the maximum overall threat sources. Second, a pairing of a threat event and a threat source. Or third, a detailed threat scenario or attack tree. In general, organizations can be expected to require more detail for highly critical missions or business functions. Common infrastructures or shared services on which multiple missions or business functions depend as common points of failure, and information systems with high criticality or sensitivity. Mission or business owners may amplify this guidance for risk hotspots, information systems, services, or critical infrastructure components of particular concern in mission or business segments. Identify information sources. Task 1-4. Identify the sources of descriptive threat, vulnerability, and impact information to be used in the risk assessment. Supplemental guidance. Descriptive information enables organizations to be able to determine the relevance of threat and vulnerability information. At Tier 1, descriptive information can include, for example, the type of risk management information security governance structures in place within organizations and how the organization identifies and prioritizes critical missions or business functions. At Tier 2, descriptive information can include, for example, information about, first, organizational mission or business processes, functional management processes, and information flows. Second, enterprise architecture, information security architecture, and the technical process flow architectures of the systems. Common infrastructures and shared services that fall within the scope of the risk assessment. And third, the external environments in which organizations operate, including, for example, the relationships and dependencies with external providers. Such information is typically found in architectural documentation, particular documentation of high-level operational views, business continuity plans, and risk assessment reports for organizational information systems, common infrastructures, and shared services that fall within the scope of the risk assessment. At Tier 3, descriptive information can include, for example, information about, first, the design of and technologies used in organizational information systems. Second, the environment in which the systems operate. Third, connectivity to and dependency on other information systems. And fourth, dependencies on common infrastructures or shared services. Such information is found in system documentation, contingency plans, and risk assessment reports for other information systems, infrastructures, and services. Sources of information as described in tables D1, E1, F1, H1, and I1 can be either internal or external to organizations. Internal sources of information that can provide insights into both threats and vulnerabilities can include, for example, risk assessment reports, incident reports, security logs, trouble tickets, and monitoring results. Note that internal information from risk assessment reports at one tier can serve as input to risk assessments at other tiers. Mission or business owners are encouraged to identify not only common infrastructure and/or support services they depend on, but also those they might use under specific operational circumstances. External sources of threat information can include cross-community organizations, for example, U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. CERT, sector partners, Defense Industrial Base, DIB, using the DoD Defense Industrial Base Collaborative Information Sharing Environment, DCISE, Information Sharing Analysis Centers, ISACs for critical infrastructure sectors, research and non-governmental organizations, for example, Carnegie Mellon University, Software Engineering Institute, CERT, and security service providers. Organizations using external sources consider the timelines, specificity, and relevance of threat information. Similar to sources of threat information, sources of vulnerability information can also be either internal or external to organizations. See Table F1. Internal sources can include, for example, vulnerability assessment reports. External sources of vulnerability information are similar to the sources identified above for threat information. As described in Table F1, information about predisposing conditions can be found in a variety of sources, including, for example, descriptions of information systems, environments of operation, shared services, common infrastructures, and enterprise architecture. As described in Table H1, sources of impact information can include, for example, mission or business impact analysis, information system components, inventories, and security categorizations. Security categorization constitutes a determination of the potential impacts should certain events occur which jeopardize the information and information systems needed by the organization to accomplish its assigned missions, protect its assets, fulfill its legal responsibilities, maintain its day-to-day functions, and protect individuals. Security categories are to be used in conjunction with vulnerability and threat information in assessing the risk to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Security categories constitute an initial summary of impact in terms of failures to meet the security objectives of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and are informed by the types of harm presented in Table H2. Identify risk model and analytic approach. Task 1-5. Identify the risk model and analytic approach to be used in the risk assessment. Supplemental guidance. Organizations define one or more risk models for use in conducting risk assessments. See Section 2.3.1. And identify which model is to be used for the risk assessment. To facilitate reciprocity of assessment results, organization-specific risk models include or can be translated into the risk factors, for example, threat, vulnerability, impact, likelihood, and predisposing condition, defined in the appendices. Organizations also identify the specific analytic approach to be used for the risk assessment, including the assessment approach, for example, quantitative, qualitative, semi-quantitative, and the analysis approach, for example, threat-oriented, asset or impact-oriented, vulnerability-oriented. For each assessable risk factor, the appendices include 3 assessment scales, 1 qualitative and 2 semi-quantitative scales, with correspondingly different representations. Organizations typically define or select and tailor from the appendices the assessment scales to be used in their risk assessments, annotating with organizationally meaningful examples for specific values and defining breakpoints between bins for semi-quantitative approaches. In addition, mission or business owners can provide further annotations with mission or business specific examples. Organizations can identify different assessment scales to be used in different circumstances. For example, for low impact information systems, organizations could use qualitative values, while for moderate and high impact systems, the most granular semi-quantitative values 0 to 100 could be used. As discussed in Special Publication 800-39, Task 1-1, risk assumptions organizations vary in the relative weights applied to risk factors. Therefore, this guideline does not specify algorithms for combining semi-quantitative values. Organization-specific risk models include algorithms, for example, formulas, tables, rules for combining risk factors. If an organization-specific risk model is not provided in the risk management strategy as part of the risks framing step, then part of this task is to specify the algorithms for combining values. Algorithms for combining risk factors reflect organizational risk tolerance. See the supplemental guidance to task 2-4 for examples. Organization-specific risk models are refined as part of preparation for a risk assessment by, first, identifying the risk model and the rationale for using it when multiple organization-specific risk models are provided. Second, providing additional examples for values of risk factors. And third, identifying any assessment-specific algorithms, for example, algorithms specific to the use of an attack graph analysis technique. In the absence of pre-existing organization-specific risk models or analytic approaches defined in the organizational risk management strategy, the risk model and analytic approaches to be used in a risk assessment are defined and documented in this task. Summary of key activities. Preparing for risk assessments. First, identify the purpose of the risk assessment. Second, identify the scope of the risk assessment. Third, identify the assumptions and constraints under which the risk assessment is conducted. Fourth, identify sources of threat, vulnerability, and impact information to be used in the risk assessment. See tables D1, E1, F1, H1, and I1 as tailored by the organization. Fifth, define or refine the risk model, assessment approach, and analysis approach to be used in the risk assessment. Conducting the risk assessment. The second step in the risk assessment process is to conduct the assessment. The objective of this step is to produce a list of information security risks that can be prioritized by risk level and used to inform risk response decisions. To accomplish this objective, organizations analyze threats and vulnerabilities, impacts and likelihood, and the uncertainty associated with the risk assessment process. This step also includes the gathering of essential information as a part of each task and is conducted in accordance with the assessment context established in the prepare step of the risk assessment process. The expectation of risk assessments is to adequately cover the entire threat space in accordance with the specific definitions, guidance, and directions established during the prepare step. However, in practice, adequate coverage within available resources may dictate generalizing threat sources, threat events, and vulnerabilities to ensure full coverage, and assessing specific detailed sources, events, and vulnerabilities only as necessary to accomplish risk assessment objectives. Conducting risk assessment includes the following specific tasks. First, identify threat sources that are relevant to organizations. Second, identify threat events that could be produced by those sources. Third, identify vulnerabilities within organizations that could be exploited by threat sources through specific threat events and the predisposing conditions that could affect successful exploitation. Fourth, determine the likelihood that the identified threat sources would initiate specific threat events and the likelihood that the threat events would be successful. Fifth, determine the adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, or organizations in the nation resulting from the exploitation of vulnerabilities by threat sources through specific threat events. And six, determine information security risks as a combination of likelihood of threat exploitation of vulnerabilities and the impact of such exploitation, including any uncertainties associated with the risk determinations. The specific tasks are presented in a sequential manner for clarity. However, in practice, some iteration among the tasks is both necessary and expected. Depending on the purpose of the risk assessment, organizations may find reordering the tasks advantageous. Whatever adjustments organizations make to the tasks described below, risk assessment should meet the stated purpose, scope, assumptions, and constraints established by the organizations initiating the assessments. To assist organizations in executing the individual tasks in the risk assessment process, a set of templates is provided in appendices D through I. These appendices provide useful information for organizations in assessing risk and can also be used to record assessment results produced during essential calculations and analysis. The templates are exemplary and can be tailored by organizations in accordance with specific organizational mission or business requirements. The use of the templates is not required in order to conduct risk assessments. Step 2. Conduct the assessment. Identify threat sources. Task 2-1. Identify and characterize threat sources of concern, including capability, intent, and targeting characteristics for adversarial threats and a range of effects for non-adversarial threats. Supplemental guidance. Organizations identify threat sources of concern and determine the characteristics associated with those threat sources. For adversarial threat sources, assess the capabilities, intentions, and targeting associated with the threat sources. For non-adversarial threat sources, assess the potential range of effects from the threat sources. The risk management strategy and the results of the prepare step provide organizational direction and guidance for conducting threat source identification and characterization, including, for example, first, sources for obtaining threat information; second, threat sources to consider by type or name; third, threat taxonomy to be used; and fourth, the process for identifying which threat sources are of concern for the risk assessment. As identified in Task 1-3, organizations make explicit any assumptions concerning threat sources, including decisions regarding the identification of threat sources when specific and credible threat information is unavailable. Organizations can also view adversarial threat sources from a broad-based perspective, considering the time such threat sources may have to exploit identify organizational vulnerabilities, the scale of the attack, and the potential use of multiple attack vectors. The identification and characterization of advanced persistent threats, APTs, can involve considerable uncertainty. Organizations annotate such threat sources with appropriate rationale and references, and providing classifications as necessary. Appendix D provides a set of exemplary tables for use in identifying threat sources. Table D1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the threat source identification task. Table D2 provides an exemplary taxonomy that can be used to identify and characterize threat sources. Table D3, D4, and D5 provide exemplary assessment scales to assess the risk factors, for example, characteristics of adversarial threat sources with regard to capability, intent, and targeting. Table D6 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the range of effects from threat events initiated by non-adversarial threat sources, and tables D7 and D8 provide templates for summarizing and documenting the results of threat source identification and characterization. If a particular type of threat source is outside the scope of the risk assessment or not relevant to the organization, the information in tables D7 and D8 can be truncated accordingly. The information produced in Task 2-1 provides threat source inputs to the risk tables in Appendix I. Summary of key activities. Task 2-1. Identify threat source inputs. See Table D1 as tailored by the organization. Identify threat sources. See Table D2 as tailored by the organization. Determine if threat sources are relevant to the organization and in scope. See Table D1 as tailored by the organization. Create or update the assessment of threat sources. See Table D7 for adversarial threat sources and Table D8 for non-adversarial threat sources as tailored by the organization. For relevant adversarial threat sources, assess adversary capability. See Table D3 as tailored by the organization. Assess adversary intent. See Table D4 as tailored by the organization. Assess adversary targeting. See Table D5 as tailored by the organization. For relevant non-adversarial threat sources, assess the range of effects from threat sources. See Table D6 as tailored by the organization.